Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're just ready to start, so I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to myself. My name's Katie Dye. I'm Councillor for Killingbeck and Seacroft, and I am the newly appointed Chair of SEAC. So as such, I've got a lot to learn, and I'm hoping that those people who've been on the committee for longer than I have are going to help me do that. In terms of my credentials in chairing this committee, that bit's very new, but in terms of my climate credentials, it's something I've been passionate about for many, many years. And those of you who know me will know that it's something that I've been working on for a long, long time. So I am really, really pleased to be here and looking forward to working with you all. We've got some new members for this new municipal year, so I welcome new members to the committee and I welcome members who've been around for a while. I'd like to thank Councillor Walshaw for the work that that SEAC did before I came into this role. I know that the work that has been done is hugely important in terms of climate change and sustainability for the city. So thank you to people who've been doing that prior to my arrival, and I hope to be able to continue with that. Just before we go on to introductions, I did ask Helen to undertake a poll of views on future formats for the meeting. So thank you to everybody for your responses. And what we're going to do is, obviously we're meeting in person here today, which is nice to do, but in the future we're going to do a mixture of remote meetings and meetings in person. Okay, so can I now ask members to introduce themselves? We'll go from the left, if that's okay.
Councillor Jordan Bowden, Councillor Jordan Bowden, Roundhay Ward.
Paul Truswell, Councillor for Middleton and Belle Isle.
Eleanor Thompson, Councillor for Guiseley and Rawdon.
Good afternoon, Councillor Peter Carlill, Cavalier and Farsley Ward.
Good afternoon, John Tudor, Killingbeck and Seacroft Ward.
Good afternoon, Al Garthwaite, Headingley and Hyde Park Ward.
Good afternoon, apologies for being late, Councillor Mohammed Shazad from the Moortown Ward.
Councillor Oliver Newton, Morley South Ward, my first committee meeting.
Councillor Paul Waters, Guys in Rawdon.
Councillor David Blackburn, finally in Wortley Ward.
Councillor Barry Anderson, Adeline Wharfdale Ward.
Councillor Neil Buckley, Woodley Ward. Actually, Chair, sorry, can I just I haven't. Can I just welcome you to this position and just echo your comments about Councillor Walshaw? We occasionally disagreed, but he worked very hard.
I'm Cassie Silverparlin. I'm going to be the clerk in the future.
And I'm Helen Graham, clerk for today.
And I'm Polly Cook, and I'm the Chief Officer for Sustainable Energy and Air Quality.
Thank you. Do other officers want to introduce themselves as well, please?
I'm Martin Elliott. I'm Head of Strategic Planning.
Harriet Spate, I'm Policy Officer in the Sustainable Energy and Air Quality team.
Chad Newton, and I'm also from the Sustainable Energy and Air Quality team.
Thank you very much. And can I remind everybody that this meeting is being webcast, and when you've finished speaking, can you please make sure you turn your microphones off? Thank you. Okay, let's move on to the agenda. Helen, are you going to pick up the first 5 items, please?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, thank you. So under agenda item number 1, there are no appeals against refusal of inspection of documents. Agenda item 2, the agenda contains no exempt information. Agenda item 3, there are no late items today. Agenda item 4 is declarations of interest. So could I ask members if they have any declarations of interest to make? Could you do so at this point, please? So there are none, it looks like. Thank you. And apologies for absence. We don't actually have any formal apologies for absence, but I'm aware that Councillor Hayden may not be able to join us today. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're moving on to item 6, which is minutes of previous meetings. I wasn't present at either of those meetings, but I would imagine a number of people in this room were. We've got 2 meetings to look at. One is the last formal meeting, which was held on the 10th of March 2021. Goodness me. So I'm assuming that you've all got minutes in your packs. What I'll do is I'll go through them page by page. If you've got anything you'd like to raise on each page, please do so. So the first page is page 5 in your packs. Page 6. Page 7. Page 8. Okay, so that then takes us through to the meeting on the 9th of March, which was this year, so not so long ago. So maybe people will remember what was discussed on that one. Page 9. Page 10. Page 11. Page 12. Page 13. Okay, so can we agree those, please? Thank you. Right, that moves us now on to our open forum. So for new members, this is where people get a chance to come and address us with any comments they'd like to make or questions they have for us. And today we've got Tony Herman from Climate Action Leeds, who's going to give us an update on the development of the community hubs. So Tony, you are very welcome.
Thank you. So I'm an associate of Together for Peace, and Together for Peace is leading on the climate hubs element of Climate Action Leeds. I'm aware, Chair, that you invited hub members to come, and I apologise, I couldn't find anyone who was able to come at short notice, so you've got me. I will attempt to give a quick overview of Climate Action Leeds, particularly for new members, and some highlights from the community hubs. Climate Action Leeds is a massively ambitious programme. We aim at wide engagement throughout Leeds. Our overarching objectives are to reach a zero carbon, nature friendly and socially just Leeds by the 2030s. Clearly we can't do this alone. We are a 2.5 million 5-year programme funded by the lottery, but in terms of the ambition, that's small beer. We really appreciate the support we've had from the City Council, right from putting in the bid, being supported by the lead member for environment, seconding officers to be part of the programme, and involvement of members and officers in various parts of the programme. It started in October 20, and we're well into our second year of the 5-year programme. The programme is a partnership of 5 organisations. Voluntary Action Leeds coordinate overall administration and finance and deal with the lottery, thankfully. We have a learning and evaluation partner called CAG Consultants, and the main work is done in 3 components. An overall city movement building ambition, and people involved there organise programme assemblies where the 40+ people who are nearly all part-time involved in delivering the programme can work collectively, and climate assemblies. We've had one, the second one is this autumn, which is open to the public, and we welcome as many people as possible. They're involved in developing a city plan Your predecessor chair launched the Leeds Donut, as the city plan is based on donut economics for sustainability. They are trying their best to open a city centre hub. We've had various problems with buildings and developers, but hopefully we're quite near opening that. And wide engagement across public, business, citizens and decision makers in Leeds. They're also responsible for a training and learning programme, which is a key part of our work. Leeds Tidal, which some of you members may know, have contracted with 4 lead organisations to work on the themes of energy, food, housing, transport, nature, work in the economy and youth and education, and also with Racial Justice Network to work on climate justice. And they're working across Leeds, bringing people together, developing a plan for the sector and supporting the community hubs. So our main task is to support the development of community climate action hubs in 8 areas. 4 have already been established, and Climate Action Seacroft, that the chair was very heavily involved and supportive in developing, Eco-Friendly Garforth, Our Future Beeston, and Otley 2030, which was already in existence, but we've supported them becoming more democratic and open to the community and with the financial resources. When those organisations were established, it took about a year's worth of development work. They're available. We have resources available to give them a 2-day-a-week support worker employed locally and resources to run activities and their local hub. We're now nearing the end of the development of 4 further areas in Alwoodley, Little London, Armley and Horsforth. You may spot some adverts coming out in the next week for hub workers in those areas, and the groups there are at the final stages of forming their organisation, their structures and their initial plans. So a few quick highlights from the first 4 areas that have been working for best part of a year. And all have hub workers in place supporting them. Our team have retreated, if you like, to a kind of light touch support, working to support the group, support the hub worker that's working directly for the group, and support the local employing organisation so that everybody works effectively together. Eco-Friendly Garforth is somewhat of an umbrella group because there were a number of quite small local groups like Incredible Edible Garforth and Garforth Hedgehogs and so on. So we helped bring them together and add some more people. Currently, they're looking at issues around food waste and have an ambitious programme of community composting. They've done a lot of work around retrofit, using a thermal imaging camera, provide for people to see where they're losing heat from houses. Competition where 5 householders have won and get professional advice to retrofit their homes, and quite a lot of community growing. Our Future Beeston, each group chooses its own name, develop its own plan. They're entirely independent in what they decide to do. We provide support and advice, and they need to stick within the overarching aims of Climate Action Leeds, but they are all independent groups and community led. So Our Future Beeston has regular meetings. They have drop-in sessions weekly, energy advice sessions. This weekend, I think it's this weekend, there's Beeston Festival and there'll be massive activity there. They've worked closely with people in the local authority around transforming the nature of vineyards, which, as members will know, are a constant source of problems. And they have a massive membership of, I'm hesitating to quote this as it's cast because I'll get it wrong, but I think several thousand people on a Facebook page for their CRAP group, which is Community Resources, and They organise loans for equipment that people can use for borrowing, for exchanging and for recycling. Otley 2030 are extremely well organised. They run a regular food bank system with a community larder. They are just developing a cargo bike delivery scheme. They have a scheme they call Small Change, which is working on a whole range of issues where people can find ways of reducing their individual carbon footprints. They have a lot of nature-friendly schemes like a wildfire programme. I could say more, but I'm aware I've only got 5 minutes. And Climate Action Seacroft is also doing a lot around nature and food, developing a really interesting forest garden and a range of community growing schemes, and have worked really successfully on engaging with local young people through schools and other ways, and had a fantastic open forum event supported by Chapel FM not that long ago. I think I've probably run out of time. I guess you don't have time for questions in this forum, but officers here have my email and phone number. If any members want to contact me afterwards, please feel free.
Thank you, Tony. I really appreciate you coming at such short notice, and it's great to hear what's going on around the city. And you're absolutely right in saying that I am involved in Climate Action Seacroft, and we're really excited by the things that we've done in such a short time and where we're going with it. So thank you for coming and talking to us. It would be great when we're not working to such a short time scale to hear from local groups as well. I think I would like that. I don't know if other members would like other people to come along and share things from a more local basis. But in the meantime, yes, if anybody would like to contact Tony, then I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you very much.
I have insisted that local groups who couldn't come here will come to one of the next 2 or even 3 meetings and provide direct information.
Thank you. Okay, we also have a video. Don't know who's going to share that. Is that Chad? Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Emma O'Neill. I'm here on behalf of Leeds MedAct, a network of health professionals using our voice to act on the climate and ecological emergency in the interests of the public's health. There's rapidly escalating alarm in the health profession about the climate and ecological emergency. In September last year, over 200 health journals released a joint call to action, warning that climate change and loss of biodiversity risk catastrophic harm to human health that will be impossible to reverse. And the WHO has called climate change the single biggest threat to human health that we have ever faced. We have numerous points and questions for this committee. However, today we will raise only one area, a reduction in air pollution. Air pollution causes at least 40,000 deaths in the UK every year, and it accounts for an estimated 1 in 3 cases of childhood asthma. It also affects many other body systems, including cognitive development. We are all susceptible, but our children are incredibly vulnerable, and they are the least responsible for this pollution. The tragic story of Ella Kissy Deborah highlights this. Ella was only 9 years old when she died of asthma. She is the first person in the UK to have air pollution stated as a contributing factor to her death on her death certificate. We want to ensure a reduction in traffic volume, cheaper zero emissions public transport, a properly enforced clean air zone, segregated cycle lanes that allow journeys through neighbourhoods, not only on sections of ring roads, to allow safe, active travel to schools in particular. Promoting and rapidly installing this infrastructure would hugely benefit air quality, tackle climate change, and benefit public health through this active travel network and a reduction in air pollution. But this needs to happen now. So our question is, how soon, how radical, and how concrete are the plans that you have for transforming Leeds transport infrastructure to facilitate these points we have raised? Thank you.
Thank you. So can I say thank you to Leeds Medact for sharing that with us, and we will ensure that you receive a response from Transport to the comments that you've raised. Thank you. Okay, so that takes us over to an update from working groups. Are you going to do that, Polly?
Yes, so we'll just quickly go through. So from the last time that we met, we've had 2 working groups. So we had the Green Finance Working Group, which met on Monday, and it was quite a late minute meeting just because a new consultation had come out related to green finance. We thought it was a good opportunity for us to comment. There were about 39 questions in total, but we just focused on 4 that were mainly linked to local authorities, the role that we can play, the barriers there are to us playing that role, how we can support SMEs, and also what the role of national government could be. And I'm pleased to say we submitted a response yesterday to that consultation that had everyone's input. The other one that's gone ahead is the Food and Biodiversity Working Group. So in that one, we looked at the food strategy that's currently under development that will go to Executive Board in October. So we looked at the objectives for the Sustainability Working Group, we looked at some of the context and the case studies, but then we also looked at the background in terms of the National Food Strategy and kind of started to identify where we thought there were gaps in that from primarily a sustainability point of view. Since that date, the new food strategy has now come out, so we will be doing a bit of a match back to that and having a look to see whether anything's been addressed or whether that gap's got wider, and we'll be taking that to a future group. And then the Buildings and Planning Group is happening soon, and that will be focused around the solar farm work that's ongoing at the moment in the city, and also looking at the net zero housing plan that's due to go to Exec Board. And then the group that has been sort of focused on behaviour change will be looking about specifically sort of engagement linked to climate adaptation. So those 2 are in the future as opposed to have happened. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to say that in the next item, you'll see that there are some proposed changes to the working groups, and one of the things that we're going to ask is that chairs of the working groups will be the people who are going to be feeding back to future meetings. Okay, so that kind of takes us on to item 8, which is the forward plan. Polly's going to introduce that, and as with all documents in your pack, I will assume that you've read them all. Thank you.
I will keep it very short and sweet to allow maximum time for discussion, but just, I suppose, to set out our approach to this, we've consulted with colleagues across the council to look at what they've got in their sort of forward work plan, especially where we think the link to climate is really strong. So things like waste, planning, transport, economy, and what we've tried to do is kind of mirror those reports through, but in a way that we can actually input before they get to a final version. So looking at things before they get to Exec Board, so that this group can actually influence the content and make sure that net zero is properly sort of recognised. The other thing that we've done is we've just mirrored at point 4, we've just listed out the kind of different strands to climate mitigation and climate adaptation from sort of the national programme. And then we've tried in our work programme in the appendix, we've tried to document which reports deal with which issues, so that we can make sure that we're kind of doing quite a round review during the year and that every area of that is being looked at. And then obviously there are the changes to the working groups, so they're all listed again in point 6. So I don't think there's probably any need for me to say any more.
Thank you, Polly. Does anybody have any questions or comments they'd like to make about that item?
Thanks, Chair. I just had a couple of questions in terms of mostly for clarity. Just looking at the embedded carbon item that's scheduled, I notice it says transport as one of the themes that's coming through. Will we be dealing with buildings as well in that, or expecting that might come up in today's discussion about the local update? And the second one I had was around travel planning. I notice it says corporate travel plan. Can I just clarify, is that our corporate travel plan, or is that corporate travel plans wider. So we'll be looking at the scope they are across all businesses in the city.
So I think the item that it's coming on embedded carbon is specifically around transport, and that's because they're doing some work that's a bit more, I suppose, further ahead than other departments. They're almost looking to see what they're doing. And I suppose that could be one of the outcomes. We start to look at how else that can be rolled out across the council. I'm just going to defer to Harriet rather than second guess in terms of the travel plan to make sure I give the right answer.
Yes, it's our corporate travel plan for the council.
Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, forgive me, Chair. As a new kid on the block, I suppose I should keep my own counsel, but it's never a skill that I've been able to develop. I appreciate that the work plan, the work programme, concentrates on a number of important components that make up our response to climate emergency. But could I ask, because obviously I've no background in serving on this particular committee, how far have we looked at growth in its broadest sense? And the reason I raise this is, for 40 years as a member of this council, well, not or wholly a member of this council, I had a sabbatical down at Westminster for a few years. I felt that our attitude to growth, and I'm sure it has changed now in the context of climate emergency, has always been that growth is a good thing and we do our utmost to mitigate its impact. Well, I think one of the reasons we're in the situation we are at the moment of having a climate emergency that spreads throughout the globe, but we're tackling our own particular bit of it, is that we've never been very effective at, and I'm going to be very crude here, identifying good growth and bad growth. And I suppose we can have debates about what constitutes bad growth. And there's one major issue facing the city that I think has exercised all of us in various ways, which I'm not going to mention. But I suppose the nub of my question is, how far do we take this panoramic view of what we see in the future being the most effective way of moving forward? And I'll give an example. We welcome with open arms new businesses to the city. For obvious reasons, they provide jobs, etc. But what we invariably find ourselves doing is that we don't staff those companies with local people because they don't have the skills. So we finish up importing, and I don't mean that as a pejorative term, lots more people into the city. And these are people who have to be housed, fed, watered, their waste has to be disposed of, they have to be transported, and we have to have all the extra infrastructure. And I'm just wondering whether, and perhaps I'm being too abstruse and generally can be, but I just wondered how far this committee has actually looked at growth and asked searching questions about what is good and what is bad, and where it's bad, how far it can be mitigated. Because, and this is my final sentence, I do feel that the gap between bad growth and how far it can be mitigated has opened very widely, not just in Leeds, not just in the UK, but globally. That's one of the reasons we're in the predicament that we are at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think if we kind of looking forward in the work plan, I think that is reflected in a number of the items we've suggested. So the social progress index in particular is looking at the city as a whole. So it's not just taking kind of economic growth, and it's looking at how everything changes and how we measure growth or measure progress in the city in a different way to sort of standard measures. So that item in November, and also the inclusive growth, I think really features in on that. And economic development colleagues have been engaging with the donut economic model and looking at how we do have, I think, what you've described as good growth. So I think in that session, there will be a focus on that. And I think that will be a good opportunity to have that discussion in more detail. But I also think in the economic and finance working group, we've included jobs and skills as part of that remit, because I think we all recognise, you know, we do have a skills gap, especially around sort of green jobs, and we need to work out how we can play a stronger role in that. And I suppose the last one, and we've got Martin here, is really sort of planning and how, you know, if we do have growth of housing, how do we make sure it's the right growth? How do we make sure, like our local plan that we're also bringing today, make sure that when we do put new houses in, they're not causing a negative impact. So there's a number of places it's picked up. I don't think we've ever had a session just dedicated to that, but we've certainly had discussions around sort of donut economics and elements like that. And members of this group previously were invited, I think, to the wider donut economics session that Economic Development ran. So thank you.
Did you want to come back, Councillor Truswell?
No, I will watch with interest.
Thank you. Councillor Buckley?
Well, just coming back on Councillor Truswell's point, he's made his point with his usual learned ability, and he's reminded us that he's been one way or another either on this council or coming back to this council for 40 years. But the thing about growth compared to 40 years ago, surely, is that 40 years ago, we had 10 million fewer people in the United Kingdom. And that's a fact. And unless we have growth, economic growth, we'll all get poorer. And in a way, we're a little bit like hamsters on a wheel, aren't we? Because the more people you have in the country, the more economic growth you're going to have. And so, obviously, all growth needs to be within the confines of the law, but we have to have private sector growth. There's no point employing another million civil servants because that's not growth, that's a cost. So we need growth, we need private sector growth to be as green as possible, but we need it.
Thank you. Was there a question in there? Was it a comment? Did you want a response from Polly?
Chair, I'll just come back on that very quickly, and I think it's Neil's kind of polarised the debate, and to some extent that's what I was talking about. I mean, in a way, it's a difference between neoliberal economics and, dare I say it, the S word, socialist economics. I think the simple lesson, though, of the last 100 years or since the Industrial Revolution is that we just cannot keep consuming. And that is what growth has been about for far too long. I won't get into the discussion about how we share the cake out more equally and more equitably, because we do know that the people who reap the strongest whirlwind from whether it's health inequalities or economic inequalities or environmental inequalities are those at the very bottom end of society. And, you know, growth of the type that you've described, Neil, has not served their purposes very well. And there's evidence all around us in this city, in this country, in this planet.
Thank you. Councillor Carlisle?
I was just going to come in briefly, and I can't find the exact figure I was trying to, so I'm hoping Polly's able to help me out with something we could circulate, because the time we had this discussion was when we got the figures back from the Big Leeds climate conversation and the conversations that had happened with residents of the city. It was quite clear in that, and I can't remember the exact question we asked, and I'm struggling to find the response, but maybe it's something officers will be able to have a look at later. But it was quite clear in that residents wanted us to look at responsible good growth, but the majority of respondents that came back to that wanted us to have the underlying view of the climate and the health of the planet as ahead of, and the health of themselves as individuals, their jobs and their prospects in the city, ahead of growth at all costs. So I think absolutely, Paul, what you're saying is completely right. And I took from that the fact that we've got a mandate from across Leeds to question growth, of whether it is good growth in their best interests and in the interest of the climate. And that is what we are therefore here, as I feel, to lead towards, and to make sure the growth we get is good growth and not, as you say, bad growth, which can be for a number of reasons: the climate, for the economic abilities and opportunities for residents who are in this city here today, regardless of the ones that may move in. And that's certainly something that I thought came loud and clear in that Big Leeds climate conversation. And therefore, the view you've put across, I think, is my view why we're here, to carry on and not to accept growth at any cost, shall I say. Good growth we're perfectly happy with.
Thank you. Is that something you wanted to respond to, Polly? I know there's a bit of a question in there.
I think I'd just have to go back and refresh. I can't quite remember a question specific to growth. I can remember, unless Chad, do you want to come in?
Yes, I've quickly looked up the Big Leeds Climate Conversation report, and we asked of those who responded, we asked them whether tackling climate change was more, less, or equally important as maintaining current levels of economic growth. And in the report, it says that more than 3/4 of residents answered either slightly more, which is 14.7%, or much more, which was 63.5%. So I think that's what you were referring to, Councillor Cullen.
Thank you. Councillor Tudor?
Yeah, I just want to come back to the donut economics. Some people in the room may be very familiar, some people may be moderately familiar, or some perhaps not at all. It's such an interesting, amazing diagram. In one way of putting it, to my mind, would be that it's the ultimate scrutiny board, covering all sectors of our world, with a social, the sweet space for humanity between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling, and perhaps a short presentation on another occasion from somebody on the what Leeds is doing with the donut economics might be sort of instructive for us.
Thank you. Is that something that's been before this committee before? And if not, is it something we could?
So we invited members of this group, but we didn't do it directly as part of this group. We could maybe do it through the working group, so the economy and finance working group, do something in there, get somebody to come and talk to us about the donut economic model.
Thank you, Polly. Anybody else want to comment on this item? Councillor Garthwaite?
Yes, just in terms of the working groups, this is a really logistical question. And I apologise if I've missed something that's been sent through. I have been on holiday and I'm still catching up. The composition of the working groups. Previously, it was really anyone could join anything they felt like. Is that going to be still the case? And how much, I suppose, the chairs will be reporting back, yes, but is there an expectation from the working groups that there will be work that comes out of them? Because I think particularly for new members, it would be useful to know what they might be taking on.
Do you want to answer that, Polly?
So I think at the moment, each working group is scheduled to have about 5 or 6 meetings a year. That can change, and obviously the working group members will drive that. We're just in the process of pulling together terms of reference for each of the groups, so there's like a really clear context. I would say a lot of the work afterwards happens from officers. So we try and do as much as possible so that it's more about the input during the meeting. I suppose with the finance group, members after that meeting then did read through what was documented and made comments on it. So it's that level, but I wouldn't say it was overly onerous. And it's just an opportunity to get a kind of more in-depth understanding of some of the areas. So I think the intention was, after we'd had today's meeting, was to write out with the various different terms of references, so people know which ones they're most interested in, and then kind of re-establish the groups with the chairs that have already been named. But that goes out to all 99 members as well, not even just those on the committee, to get as wide representation.
Something else I could have asked as well. I used to attend the Leeds Climate Commission engagement and communication group, which I then stopped because I wasn't on the communication working group. But I can see a lot of potential overlap between in the remit, and I wondered how much liaison there is between those particular groups.
So I'm on the Leeds Climate Commission and also the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission. So I kind of have oversight of all of those, trying to make sure that we don't duplicate, and if things are happening in other areas, we bring them forward. And there's different people within the team on some of the working groups of the Climate Commission and things. So again, we just try and make sure we've got the right people providing that crossover. So I'm fairly confident what we do kind of improves the wider offer and there isn't duplication.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments on this item? So before I bring it to a close, just a couple of things from me. The first one was to refer to the October meeting, which is specifically for a consultation on the local plan, which we're going to hear about later today. And then also to say that we're going to invite a director to each of the future meetings. And at those meetings, we're then going to be able to ask questions of what's happening in their directorate regarding addressing climate change. So that'll be a rolling programme throughout the year. Okay, right, in that case, let's move on. So we're moving to item 9, and is Chad going to present that, or Polly? Chad.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I'm just sharing my screen. Earlier in the year, in the last municipal year, members of the committee will have heard presentations on climate adaptation. At that point, we were basically setting out the kind of programme of work ahead. And so the report that members have received today is an update on that work. And I can just provide a kind of a presentation overview, potentially for anyone watching at home, and as just a recap of some of those points before we start the discussion. So the first thing that the report kind of explains, and the most important bit of context, is kind of what do we mean when we're talking about climate adaptation. So we're talking about any action that minimises the impact of current levels, expected levels, and the potential levels of climate change. We're not starting from scratch on this piece of work. The Committee on Climate Change and the UK government have published 2 key reports which outlines what the risks are to the UK at a national level in detail. So what we're wanting to do going forward is consider how can Leeds support that work and support the work of the National Adaptation Programme. The other thing that we want to be really clear about is explaining that until global net zero is reached, the risks will continue to amplify. So adaptation resilience is key, but it's complementary of mitigation, and it isn't an alternative plan. The graphic you can see, which was also included in the report, is just a brief summary from the Met Office of some of the impacts that UK cities will experience of climate change in the future. And going forward, for ease of engagement, we're going to summarise the climate risks for Leeds by hazard, which we can kind of summarise into these kind of 4 themes. So there's the risks from extreme and prolonged heat, there's a risk of flooding, there's a risk of future drought or water supply disruption, and then finally there's cascading impacts and how that might affect the city. So where other parts of the world or the country experience climate hazards, that can have knock-on impacts for Leeds. And in the report we've referred to it as economic impacts, because quite a lot of those effects would be reflected in an economic perspective, such as pictured, a supply chain disruption. In talking of the general aims of adaptation, we can, I should explain that any risk is a combination of 3 factors, which is a hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and it's the intersection of those 3 factors that creates risk. And so how you respond to those and how you alleviate those is the approach that you would take in terms of adaptation. So there are 4 broad aims, which we kind of highlighted in the report. So you can prevent some hazards from occurring. So a good example of that would be, for example, upstream actions, a catchment-based approach in terms of reducing flooding. Sometimes you can protect, the city from, a flood is a good example. The flood alleviation scheme has a range of kind of engineered and natural flood protections in place. But if you fail to do both of those, then you then have to respond to a hazard when it occurs and eventually have to recover from that hazard. This isn't meant to be a hierarchy because we don't know, for different risks, it will be a different balance. But what we're saying is we need to look into the future and try and consider the costs and the benefits of different approaches for all the risks and how they would affect Leeds. There's a really nice graphic which you can see pictured, which the Committee on Climate Change has created, which is their 10 principles of climate adaptation. One that I'd like to point out in particular is number 3, which is we should adapt to 2 degrees of global warming, even if that isn't what the UK government and many members of this panel, I'm sure, would want to see. And certainly we wouldn't want to see the risk of 4 degrees of global warming, but the Committee on Climate Change recommend that we do at least assess the risks of that, so we can factor that into decision making going forward. The report has the following recommendations, so I won't dwell on this slide, but the following slides will just provide a brief summary. So there is already significant work across the council taking place, even if it hasn't been considered in the round in terms of climate adaptation. So, for example, the proposed updates to the local plan, the flood risk management strategy, and the work that Public Health do with their heatwave plan, all is very, very closely linked to climate adaptation in some way. We also have robust arrangements in place in terms of responding to severe weather events. And every time we do so, we learn from what has happened and use that to inform the plan going forward. So this, just to shout out the work of the Resilience and Emergencies team, Public Health, and how that feeds into the West Yorkshire Local Resilience Forum, which plays a key role in any kind of disaster response. The council also has previous experience of dealing with some of these cascading impacts and dealing with some of these potential or real economic disruptions linked to national or international events. So in COVID, we successfully managed supply chain disruptions, for example, and going forward, resilience has been highlighted by economic development as a key aim of the Leeds Economic Recovery Framework, and they identified climate resilience as one part of that. And going forward, there's already several key policies in development. But there is more that we can do, and there is more that we want to do to understand any gaps and opportunities that there might be for the council and for the city, which is why over the next 12 months, we plan to work with services to do a service-led climate risk assessment, starting with an initial audit, followed by a series of workshops. And we've got really 2 key questions as part of that work with services. Will their service or service users be affected by the future impacts of climate change and how that will change in the next few decades? And secondly, is there anything more that their service can be doing to help prevent and protect against some of these hazards? So the Sustainable Energy and Air Quality team, with the support of flood risk management, will coordinate this work and support it. And we'll also be supported by academic partners, and we'll be working with the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission. So the report also mentions that a task and finish group has been established at the Yorkshire, Humber and Climate Commission level, which will enable sharing of insight, skills, tools and lessons learned across the region's authorities, and that will be led by the Environment Agency and LCC representatives on the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission. And fourthly, we also know that engagement is going to be really important going forward. And we have done engagement in terms of the climate change response in the past, and Councillor Carlill's already mentioned the Big Leeds Climate Conversation that took place in 2019. But we want to refresh that and, I guess, touch base with the city once again. And so after so later this year, we want to publish an online climate action plan, which brings together and summarises the council's plans across all aspects of mitigation and adaptation in an accessible way. And then we'll use that as an opportunity to engage with individuals, communities and organisations across Leeds, and prompt the city to have its say on our plans. so that we're getting an update in terms of what the city think, which I know members have commented in previous meetings as really, really important. The final thing I want to say before I close the presentation is that there are really clear links between the climate adaptation work and the Best City Ambition. You know, a healthier population where there is less poverty will, you know, be more resilient to climate hazards. But equally, the efforts and the actions that we do to adapt and improve resilience will themselves improve the health and well-being of the city and support inclusive economic growth. So those 2 points will feed into each other, and I hope you can see how adaptation really fits into what the city and the team leads approach is trying to achieve. I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chad. So our remit for this item is to make any comments that we'd like to make. This report will then go to Exec Board in July, and then we have to agree the recommendations. So who would like to start the discussion? Councillor Blackburn.
I can welcome the report for starters, but I've got to say that there's many things when it comes to flooding. We have many areas of this city where we have flooding on a regular basis, and over recent years that's got worse. And our ability to cope with it as a council has been bad. I've got to say the Environment Agency, well, I personally think Environment Agency isn't fit for purpose at all, and we need something else instead. But we don't seem to be talking about that. You know, we're talking about the big incidents that happen, not the smaller ones on the smaller becks and rivers that are tributaries of air along the wharf and colder. We don't seem to be talking about that, and we've had some serious problems there that caused both difficulties to residents, but also economic difficulties when roads get flooded. So I'd like to see a bit more of that, and I'd like to see a bit more, a bit more sting in the tail about it, and about the fact that the Environment Agency ain't always doing what it could do.
Thank you. Does anybody want to comment on that?
I suppose only to say that the person that we're working with from the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission is actually from the Environment Agency, so it allows us an opportunity to make sure we're linking in properly and to provide feedback.
Thank you. Councillor Buckley.
Thank you, Chair. And just talking about outside agencies, I don't know whether you remember, but we had somebody from Yorkshire Water who attended a meeting. It was on an online meeting, and he made a presentation along the lines of how good it was that Yorkshire Water were corporate partners of the city and did everything right. And a lot of what he said was perfectly valid. But I asked him the question, and I've subsequently followed it up and got absolutely nowhere. And the question was that within a mile diameter of where I live, Yorkshire Water have sold off 2 woods, if not 3. 2, if not 3. And the only reason for selling them off has been to sell them to somebody who wanted a speculative punt on whether he could get planning permission to build a house. And so this then, they've then produced some money for their balance sheet, and I understand that they've got a duty to do this. But in terms of corporate responsibility, it's not very impressive, because it then sets off an ongoing battle royal between the person who's bought the wood and an endless succession of planning applications, which then go to appeal. And at the end, everybody's worn out. And the likelihood is 10 years down the line, guess what? Go on, then we'll give you permission. And I just wondered whether there was some way of gently inviting Yorkshire Water to comment on whether this programme of selling off woods is ongoing. And if so, how far have they got with it?
Thank you. Is that something we can chase up with Yorkshire Water if that's been raised in a previous meeting and get a response from them?
But I think in the previous meeting they invited Councillor Buckley to do that, so we didn't do it as a committee, did we? But I can follow up with Yorkshire Water with some of my contacts and see if we can get a bit more of a formal response.
That's right, Polly, and I did that, and it was a brick wall.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Polly. Councillor Carlisle.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, I was just going to touch on some of the next points of this report, because I think if everything's right, we're heading for, at the moment, unless anything else is agreed, something around a 2-degree warmed world, which means some of the things that are in here as risks are possibly definites, should we say, not possibles. And we're already seeing some problems. David highlighted some of those issues, but I mean, it's not well, it's quite a few years since the Stanningley bypass, for instance, got warped due to the heat, and we'd never imagined that it would get to 30 degrees and it suddenly had speed bumps that weren't supposed to be there on a 60-mile-an-hour road. So these problems are already happening. So some of these issues that could occur, and today's a good day to talk about extreme heat, some of these issues are ones that could occur within the next decade. Some are ones that will occur in 100 years. So I wondered, how are we going to face that task? Because the heating of things like our streets, and I walked today down to the bus stop and it was an extremely hot walk, and I was thinking, well, I couldn't cope in much hotter than this. I then stood in a glass bus shelter, which effectively became a greenhouse, thinking, oh, well, this is going to be a problem, isn't it? And if anyone wants any more impetus, my shirts get more ridiculous the hotter it is. So if this is a 22-degree shirt, then let's see what happens in 2 or 3 more degrees time. And I have to start buying some really ridiculous ones. But some of these things are things we know are going to happen now, and we could make changes. So in terms of, things like the bus stops, that's something that we could start rolling out a complete different design of bus stops now. And we know they're going to happen, but I don't imagine that we're at the point where suddenly every bus stop has been redesigned and we're going to start sending in ones that aren't greenhouses. So how can we make sure that the plan for this identifies those most short-term risks first, and that we work on some of the smaller actions that might make a difference over that time, and then allows us, as you say, we must look at the risk of a 4-degree world, because we don't know. Councillor Buckley will take us to China or Venezuela or somewhere later on where their record may not be as good as ours. So we do have to have that view that not everyone might get to the same conclusion we are and might not get to the solution that we want to. So we might not get where we want. But how do we separate that out? So we do some action now, then get on to the ones that need to be taken later. But also we do assess the risk of what could happen, which could be catastrophic later on.
Thanks, Councillor. So I think one of the pieces of work that I mentioned is working with academic partners. One of the aims of that is to, for lack of a better term, translate some of the models. There are loads of climate models which can kind of explain how the climate will be changing, and you can apply that to Leeds in the next 10 years, the next 20 years and 30 years. They're quite complicated to understand, and to the average layperson. So one of the pieces of work that we want to work with the academic partners on is translating that into something that we can then bring to those workshops, which we can have with highways, for example, and we will have with highways, so that they can then take that in. And we recognise that highways are the expert of highways, and what the effects of heat will be on highways. In a different, and parks will be the experts on, okay, what will the changes in temperature in the next 10 years mean on shrubs, for instance, that in their parks. So this is why we believe it's really key that it has to be a service led. But what we can do to support that is to set out, okay, what will the changes be in the next 5 years, 10 years, and do that in a way where it's easy for them to understand, and run scenarios, and then consider potentially how they can add that to their risk registers and how they can use it to inform and influence their own policy. So I hope that answers your question.
Did you want to come back on that? Anybody else wanting to ask any questions on this item? Okay. Councillor Anderson.
Elliot here. paragraph 34 about the design of buildings. Now, there was a planning application came forward in one of our wards, and they were going to put in air conditioning rather than, because they were going to keep the windows closed, permanently closed. Because we've not got policies, what can we do in the interim to implement paragraph 34 from a planning perspective to ensure that our planning officers actually pay attention to it rather than hiding behind the fact that we've not yet got the policies in place? I know it's picking on Martin, and Martin is only responsible for the strategic, but David Feeney's not here to ask him what he's going to do to make sure that planning management actually do implement it when they bring applications to us.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Anderson. We can encourage, we can use the declaration of the climate emergency as what's known in planning as a material consideration, a factor to be taken into account in the determination of planning permission. But the starting point for considering planning applications must always be the development plan. And at the moment, our policies in the development plan don't go as far as we'd like them to. And they're catching up with the declared climate emergency. And that's what I'm going to talk about next in the next agenda item, in terms of how those policies are shaping up. So until those policies have been written up and published, we can't depend on them.
Why can't the development control officers in the report say we have asked the applicants if they would comply with this and this, and we can then, as members of plans panels, make our appropriate judgment when the officer reports back and says we've asked them and they've said no?
It could certainly be something that would be reflected in the report in terms of any negotiation that's gone on, Councillor, and I'll feed back to Jonathan Carr and David Feeney on that basis. But the strength that the council would have in terms of defending a refusal of planning application and appeal would be pretty minimal, given that it wasn't basing that decision on a policy within a plan.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that one, Martin. We'll come back to you in a very short time, but we need to agree the recommendations first. So, assuming everybody has sight of the recommendations, recommendation A, are we happy to agree that? Yep. Page 23, sorry, yes, for those of you scrolling furiously. Okay, people who are just finding it, are you happy with that? Recommendation A? Yes. Recommendation B? Recommendation C? Recommendation D? And finally, E. Okay, thank you very much. So that brings us on to item 10, and it's back to you, Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Dye. I'll just share the presentation. Okay, thank you. So it's been really interesting to hear the conversation so far, because a lot of what's been talked about already today relates to the policies that we're seeking to bring through the local plan. And just for those members that might not be aware, the local plan is our statutory plan for Leeds, which influences new development within the city. It has a statutory legal basis, so therefore that the policies within it there, developers are obliged to start with those policies when they submit development for planning permission. So it can be quite a powerful tool in terms of steering the sorts of development that we want to see into the future, the sorts of sustainable good growth that Councillor Trustwell talked about earlier when he was talking about growth within the city and the levers that planning can bring in terms of dealing with those. There's 5 topics, and hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at the paper and see that there's 5 broad areas. So that's around carbon reduction, that's around green infrastructure and blue infrastructure, it's around placemaking, sustainable infrastructure, and flood risk. And we took those 5 topics out for public consultation late summer last year, and we had around 800 detailed responses to that. And the good news was that the vast majority of those responses were highly supportive to what the council were proposing to achieve and the broad direction of travel for those policies. Earlier this year, we re-clarified the scope of the plan on the basis of comments received, which involved just tweaking some of the broad topics, but essentially keeping that as a collective of topics. And I should say that was about not only looking at carbon mitigation in terms of measures to reduce carbon within the city, not only looking at climate change adaptation in terms of looking at the resilience that the city has to that, but also taking into account some of the messages we were getting through about the pandemic and how communities were responding to that, but also dealing with the nature conservation crisis and the biodiversity crisis, and also fundamentally the health and wellbeing agenda. So in so doing, the local plan update scope was really meeting the sort of the 3 council pillars quite square on. Since that consultation, there's been evidence gathering and what's called a sustainability assessment. Because the plan is a legal document, it needs an awful lot of preparation behind it, because it will be tested independently and scrutinised by an independent examiner. So we need to make sure that the policies that we're putting forward have got a real evidence base behind them and can be defended at such an inquiry. And we're in the stage now of nearly reaching the end of policy drafting. And those draft policies are actually going to go to a workshop of development plan panel who have thus far helped to steer the local plan update in the middle of July. So what I'll do today is I'll just give you some headlines around that, because we don't have all of that fully drafted for you, and then I'll take questions. So just quickly going through the topics, you'll see at the back of the paper that I set out in bullet form some of the main issues that are arising from these topics. But topic 1's around carbon reduction. I suppose this is looking at a fairly radical rewrite of the policies that we've got in the plan already, because we've already got a policy that seeks development to go beyond where building regulations takes it in terms of its carbon efficiency. But we're introducing a policy around whole life cycle carbon emissions. So that's looking at the building and development, right from the materials that are used, whether an existing building is to be demolished or not, right the way through to the use and afterlife of that building, to encourage developers to start to understand those concepts. This won't be a policy that we expect will determine a grant or a refusal of planning permission, because there's some parts of the whole life cycle carbon emissions calculations that simply can't be met yet, in terms of substituting other materials for concrete, for example, and sustainable concrete. Those sorts of materials don't exist in the quantity that we need them to in order to ensure that they can support development consistently within Leeds. But what this requirement to do an assessment does is it starts to build up an evidence base for the city. It starts to get developers used to these concepts, and it starts to enable us to understand where the quick wins are, where we can actually be focusing in on what all developers need to be doing. And if developers are struggling to achieve some of this, why they're struggling to do that, and what the council can do potentially through its other routes to support them. Zero carbon developments will be a ratcheting up of the current policy that we've got to ensure that developments are aiming for zero carbon. The policy will set out what that means and a range of ways in which that can be achieved through an energy hierarchy. One of the things that the policy is looking to focus on is built fabric efficiency. The government's Future Homes Standard, which is due to come out in 2025, really does take us a lot further towards zero carbon, but does so on the basis of a decarbonised electricity grid. Whereas I think what the council's trying to do through this policy is couple that with a fabric first approach, so that in 5, 10, 20 years time, the fabric of the building is really the best it can be to withstand other potential energy generation technologies that can go into that building. And also fundamentally, that reduces the cost of heating properties, which is a significant cost now, especially in the cost of living crisis. Sustainable construction is another element that we're focusing on. That looks at things like materials and water use of the building. We're also looking at locations for renewable energy, where we can encourage and where the council can be positive about wind turbine locations and solar farm locations within parts of Leeds, taking into account headline constraints such as landscape, nature conservation, proximity to susceptible uses, bird flight, for example, and also looking at policies to be more encouraging of energy storage within developments, because that's going to be a key factor as we move to more away from fossil fuels into decarbonised electricity. The second topic, it tries to bring a lot of this together around what's called placemaking. Conscious that the English Housing Survey a couple of years ago now was pretty scathing of new housing development and said it just wasn't of a good quality. You'll see a real change in national planning guidance around design. You'll know that the government's talked about beauty in terms of design. What these policies seek to do is try to say, well, what does that mean for Leeds? What do we want local places to look like? What do we want housing estates to look like? So there'll be a stronger basis for good design in that policy. There'll be changes to our housing density policy to ensure that we're making the most of land that's released for housing. And actually by housing density, you can actually get some of those carbon efficiency gains within the built fabric of a building much more easily than if you build to a lower density. This is where our links to the Connecting Leeds strategy, which aims to be for Leeds to be a city where you don't need to own a car, can be quite strongly expressed, but also something quite new for Leeds. And something which a lot of cities, European cities, are looking at is this concept of a 20-minute neighbourhood. We've often talked about accessibility when we look at distribution of housing land within Leeds, and we look at justifying its location based on its access to certain things. The 20-minute neighbourhood principle takes that a lot further. It includes a wider basket of things that people should be expected to walk to within 10 minutes there and 10 minutes back. Not only saying that where in Leeds this currently happens would be a good place subject to other considerations for development, but saying, well, if you want to develop and you haven't got these 20-minute attributes, then can that development actually deliver these 20-minute attributes? And that's just a graphic there to start to look at some of the evidence-based work that we're doing around that. Flood risk is looking to both update our assessment in terms of what our flood susceptibility in Leeds is based on climate change allowances. So that's looking at if we have this much temperature increase, what might our susceptibility to flooding be in the future, and actually writing policies that are very much more aware of that susceptibility and encouraging, requiring development to take that into account. Avoiding development in those areas that are at highest risk of flooding, such as the functional floodplain, especially where that's within the main urban area. We've often had within planning what's called the exceptions test, where we've looked to balance the fact that whilst a bit of land might flood, to all other intents and purposes, it's really sustainable and it's in a really good location. we're kind of saying, well, actually, is that really the balance we need to strike now? Should we be looking more strongly at resisting development within those particular areas? And also looking at the way in which developments which can be delivered now behind the flood alleviation scheme also need to take account of, well, what happens if that breaches, so that we really understand that there are measures in place within that development to deal with water and make it more resilient. Green infrastructure, there's quite a lot going on within that policy. That's where we bring together a clearer understanding of the purpose of green infrastructure, particularly for movement of plants and animals, which ties into the biodiversity theme, but also to support the movement of people, which supports healthier communities and active travel. Looking at green space update, to really make sure that the green spaces that we're getting within new developments are of a quality which meets our health and wellbeing agenda and meets the sorts of places that people want to live. Too often, green spaces, when they're delivered, are an afterthought and are sterile. And just because they're green doesn't mean they're green space if they don't actually perform a function. Trees as well. Looking at, if I just skip on there, you won't be able to read that, but that's just to show that there is work going on around calculating the carbon sequestration value of trees within the city, not just their amenity value, and weaving that into a policy which updates Leeds as current. If you have to lose a tree, replace it with 3, to if you have to lose a tree, replace it with an equal number of trees that will replace that carbon sequestration value that's been lost. And finally, sustainable infrastructure, which looks at rolling out policies around digital connectivity to ensure that new places are really accessible to modern digital connectivity, which can avoid the need to travel. Providing strategic support for mass transit, which will also be linked to the 20-minute neighbourhoods, and looking at policies around Leeds station upgrade and HS2, and finally considering policies around the airport. Very quickly to finish off, as I say, DPP workshop in July, consultation material will be prepared in August. We'll go to DPP and Exec Board in September, and then we'll have public consultation in October. And we've committed to come back to this forum during October, so that this group can make formal comments on those policies that are drafted. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Martin. A really, really interesting piece of work. Thank you for sharing that with us. I've got Councillor Garthwaite wanting to come in, and Councillor Blackburn.
Thank you for this report. Very interesting and a lot in it. Some of which has been going on for some time and some of which is a bit more new. I'd just make a few comments or questions. I welcome the talk of not paving over gardens, but I think there are lots of reasons for not paving over gardens, and flood risk is only one of them. For example, biodiversity, increasing and preserving the green infrastructure, absorption of carbon by trees, and also hedges, very important. And I think that this is something that the Leeds Parks and Green Space Forum have been talking about for a considerable amount of time. And it is important to make that quite a large citywide strategy, because a lot of people are paving over their gardens for reasons of time, for reasons of wanting to park their cars, for reasons of putting, I don't know, sheds up or sort of barbecue sheds. I've seen that quite a lot. I don't quite know what to call that, but like ovens enclosed. And I don't see it as a positive thing that is happening. So the more we can do in that direction, the better. Moving on to green and blue infrastructure, I see a lot here about green, but not really blue, which is of course the water. And water is not necessarily a bad thing. Active travel, mass transit, using the canal network. Those who've been on this committee for some time have heard me on this subject before. For goods as well as for transporting people. And I think that is really key. Using decent fuel, of course, not polluting fuel, but I think that is something that we should really continue to prioritise. I don't want to see it getting lost. And also another thing about the blue infrastructure, it does help the movement of plants and animals, not necessarily the West Nile virus or whatever, but also those animals like frogs and toads. I used to have a sticker on my car called Help a Toad Across the Road. And I've seen recently a lot of volunteers who are doing just that. They go out at night and they make quite sure that the toads aren't squashed when they go back to their breeding ground from wherever they've gone to before. And they are a really important part of general biodiversity. And I think we can be positive about water as well as negative. And finally, it would be useful to hear a bit more about the airport policy, if there's any more thoughts being developed on that at the moment. Thank you, Chair.
Did you want to come back on those points, please, Mark?
Just on a couple of them, please, Chair. So thanks, Councillor Garthwaite. So in terms of the canal network, I agree we should be encouraging more goods to be transported by canal. We do have a policy that protects wharfs, and that's really important, and that's come into its own recently with the acceptance of the sand and gravel coming into Leeds on canal barges. So that's really positive. In terms of blue infrastructure, yeah, when we talk about green infrastructure and we talk about green space, and I talk about the quality of green space, we'll seek to improve the quality of green space by lining that up with making space for water within developments. Too often developments, when they're faced with having to deal with wastewater and deal with water issues and drainage issues, they put it underground in giant containers. We're trying to avoid that. We're saying that needs to be above ground, and it needs to be part of the kind of the amenity within a space. Yeah, I think that was it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Blackburn.
Can I just say I welcome what you just said there, and agree a lot with what Councillor Garthwaite was on about. But as somebody who sat on, during my sort of 24 years on council, sat on planning for most of that time, it's nice to find out that, and knowing how long things take to change. You're talking about, what was it, late 2023 when it goes for public examination. When's it likely we on planning committees will be able to use that? Because it really annoys me the time it takes, and I'm not blaming anybody on this council, because you've got to go through procedures you've got to go through, and certainly not blaming officers, but it seems to take forever to change things, and we haven't got forever, we've got a limited time. And let's put it this way, what we're giving planning permission to this week or next week could be built in 5 and 6 years' time, when things are different. So I think it's important we do it as quick as we can, but I'd like to know what that, and as I say, take that as no criticism, because I think you're doing your best.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that?
Thanks, Councillor Blackburn. So Power 3 in the report sets out what national guidance says about giving weight to policies in emerging plans, because that's really what you're talking about. And it depends on 3 things. One is the stage of preparation. So once we've drafted the policies and we've put them out to consultation, there'll be an advanced stage of preparation. We can start to apply weight to them, and we can start to discuss them at planning committee, but it will depend on the extent to which there's unresolved objection to those policies. So if we've got some of those policies that haven't attracted objection, then actually you can start to apply weight to those. And the other thing is their consistency with the NPPF, which is national guidance. So where we're looking to go beyond the NPPF, we might find it a bit more difficult to start applying those early, and you will need to wait for adoption of the plan.
Thank you. Councillor Wadsworth.
Thank you, Chair. And with regards to the waterways, I agree to what Councillor Garthwaite is saying. We should really be protecting our waterway. We've got a very valuable asset in the city that takes us out to the East Coast indirectly, but we should be using it. But my main point really, Martin, is about there's not much about micro-generation in here. I appreciate you working on the fabric of the building, and that is government policy to work on the fabric and reduce what is emitted, but there's not very much on micro-generation, particularly, I mean,
my personal view is the aesthetics of microgeneration, particularly solar, if it goes in at the building stage, it looks better and works better. But there is also nothing about the profiles of the roof. We need to keep as many self-profiling roofs, because so many people that have older houses say, I can't use solar panels because I've got a north-facing roof, with regards to that. And there doesn't seem to be anything about using grey water. You talked about storing the water in an amenity, but surely the real best way would be to use the roof water to be able to flush the toilets. It's happening in industry and in hotels. A lot of hotels you go in now say we are using grey water to flush the toilets, but it doesn't happen in the domestic environment at all, really. And I think we need to try and progress that we use the water twice, we get more out of it.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, thanks for those points, Councillor Mosworth. So the point about microgeneration, the carbon reduction policy there's two things. The first is we've had debates with developers, and this was one of the questions we raised at the consultation, as to how prescriptive or flexible does this policy need to be. And developers are very much saying to us, we need this to be flexible. So you need to sort of say to us what your end point is, but you need to leave us to be able to get there. So what we've done is we've framed the policy. We're starting to look to frame the policy, which very much says, consider your layout, get as many south-facing roofs as you can, and south-facing aspects, because you'll get passive heating in that respect. Consider your energy hierarchy and the fabric of your building. Then consider how you're going to heat and power your building, and all the way trying to get towards zero carbon. And that sort of third stage around considering how you heat and power, a lot of that will be from the grid, which looks to be sort of decarbonised already, but actually the more that developers can put on in terms of microgeneration, the more they can get towards that zero carbon. So it's not dissuading them from doing that; it'll be encouraging them to do that, but as part of a package of measures that give them flexibility to get to zero carbon. The third point, which I haven't mentioned in my presentation, is any unaccounted for carbon within the building. What we're looking at the moment is whether we can have a contribution then that goes into a pot to help retrofit elsewhere within the city. So we're at the moment we're testing that through, because I think as an ambition, that's quite different to what a lot of local authorities are doing. But hopefully that gives you the comfort that it's in the mix. On the grey water recycling, it's a good point. I don't know the answer. I will go back to the person who's preparing that policy. I know that we're seeking to reduce water use within dwellings, but how far we're going in terms of grey water, I can certainly get back to you.
I welcome the fact that the layout is correct. I just think the developer would want a flexible policy, because wouldn't they want a flexible policy so they can do as they want? I think that for the benefit of the city and the world in the way of generating it and people's economics, speaking from someone who has solar panels and uses much less electricity in some of them, my provider ever says that they think I do until they see my meter readings, and then they think, how could you do that? Well, I do it because I have solar panels, because they know I have solar panels, but they don't effectively know how much they're generating or how little I'm using, in a sense, through the grid. So they would want that flexibility. The point I forgot to make was the 20-minute neighbourhoods. Whilst the 20-minute neighbourhoods are great for places like Guiseley, and today is an example where people are using the 20-minute neighbourhoods because there are no trains, the city centre will have to adapt to that. And it's how we adapt the city centre, because effectively the city centre's pretty dead today because everybody's using a 20-minute neighbourhood because there's no trains to get anywhere. But if that happens on a very regular occasion, and COVID has pushed that as well, then ultimately the city centre will have to adapt. Otherwise, we will be ruining one part of the area to benefit another. Climate-wise, we may be making a benefit, but we also do have to look at Councillor Trustwell's economics position.
Thank you. Councillor Carlisle.
Thanks. Yeah, I had a couple of bits. I mean, following on from David's point, really, because when we sat on City Plans panel with larger developments in front of us, you're seen really as our panacea. We're all there saying, well, when this work is done, we can have exactly what we want out of this development. And that's what we're all leading for. So I think we're all hoping that this comes through and then is able to be used as that. Because yeah, we're letting things through that we wouldn't want to accept at the moment every single day. And as you say, David, I've been elected now for 4 years, and I think I've only seen a handful of the buildings put up that I've ever been on a planning panel for. So yeah, they'll be being developed until the late 2020s, certainly. So that's an important one. The points about blue infrastructure are really valuable that Councillor Garthwaite made, because I'd seen, and I think it was in this meeting before that I quoted, that I'd seen research that says, in fact, ponds can be better at sequestering carbon than woodlands. And in fact, they're a different habitat. So while we're going around planting trees everywhere, that's fine, but it's a single habitat if it ends up being the same trees in the same areas, which it invariably will be if they're the ones that suit that particular location. And obviously that's an alternative habitat. So that's really good to hear. Some of those conversations around keeping the water on the site and not just hiding it away. The areas around transport I was going to touch on quickly, because it obviously mentions mass transit, but as far as we are now, mass transit isn't going to come in until 2040, if it comes at all. So it's the policies before that, I think, that I'm most concerned about. I noticed there isn't mention of buses in here, and I guess, is that because the transport strategy and the SPD are already adopted plans, and therefore we don't see the need to take that further? Just as a clarification on that. And I guess the one point I can't remember whether is in is a thing about shuttle buses on developments, which we provide for a period of time in areas where there's no bus service, but quite often they're not provided for the length of time needed, because by the time the last house is being built, it might have already finished. And by that point, they may have come up with an excuse that it wasn't viable, and they may have managed to get out of providing it anyway. So just around if those are in. I want to make a comment then on the 20-minute neighbourhood, because I think that approach is excellent. A bit in the city centre one, I think we've got a slight problem that there's people who could walk into the city centre, but we've got those barriers in the way. So there's communities that live just outside the city centre could have better access, and that's what I'm hoping we end up with, because this could be a perfect 20-minute neighbourhood with everything here. I'm thinking of where I represent, and I represent probably 6 or 7 different communities. Only 2 of those are probably what I would class as a 20-minute neighbourhood. So the village of Farsley has everything in you'd probably ever need, and the community of Stanningley has everything in you need. But Carverley, you'd struggle when you needed your groceries, and the communities on the outskirts of Pudsey would struggle if you needed anything really to get there in 20 minutes. So obviously we saw your map that you put up of areas that could be 20-minute neighbourhoods in Leeds. The priority that we have is trying to make sure that more of those areas are 20-minute neighbourhoods and become them. How do we then work with developers, knowing what they're like, to not look at your map and look at West Leeds and say, right, well, Horsforth's got everything we need, let's build as much as possible around the edge of Horsforth, rather than say, well, let's go to this other community that needs it, where we may be able to help provide the primary school, the doctors, the shops they need. How do we make that policy have that slant in a positive way, rather than end up directing them to just one place? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Carlisle. So I think what you're doing there is you're preempting where we go next with the local plan. And I think I mentioned in the report there'll be a local plan 2, which will look at housing and employment, subject to development plan panels endorsement of those topics. But it'll also look at how we need to respond to the strategic policies we're setting through these carbon policies, as they apply to things like new housing development and new employment development and distribution of land. At the moment, the means we have to distribute housing across the city is through a policy that talks about percentages per housing market character area. The 20-minute neighbourhood, if we get that enshrined in a strategic policy, will give us the basis then to do that in a different way. And it will then start to look at not purely driving distribution of development, but the 20-minute neighbourhood is much more of a front priority to determine development, but then still look at, well, where are our opportunities to create 20-minute neighbourhoods, and how might new development facilitate that? So that conversation will happen, but it'll happen at the next stage of plan making through local plan update 2, because that's where the plan can release those additional sites to make that happen. But in terms of the transport points you were making, I think you did get to the right place in that. Yeah, this works alongside the transport strategy and the transport SPD. Planning can't really set out the required modes of transport. It just has to make sure that locations are accessible and the layouts of developments enable active travel and public transport provision as much as possible, including location next to transport interchanges, which is kind of where the mass transit side of it comes into. We've got a long way to go on mass transit, as you say, but if we can set a policy in this plan here which supports mass transit being delivered for the city and lines that up with the 20-minute neighbourhood approach, when it comes to looking at the routes for mass transit, that can very strongly influence where they go. And that can then get the proper link between housing growth and mass transit provision.
Did you want to come back?
Just very briefly, yeah. Thank you, yeah. And that helps me get the connection between the two. The one thing I always think of mass transit is when we look at it now, the easiest corridors to see, and if I use an example from my area, because it's the ones I know better, you can look at the number 72 bus route from Bradford to Leeds and know that it is full any time of the day, whatever day it is. It will be absolutely packed and people will have to move their bags whenever you go to get in. We see that then as a very easy corridor to put mass transit in, not talking about how you fit it literally on the ground, but it already has there the scope to be. I see some of the planning policies could really help with that. If we get a 10-minute frequency bus route into an area through planning, then that gives you a corridor that has the opportunity to build up to being whatever a mass transit corridor happens to be in 2040. Through my area, we've ended up with one of those purely just because we're right in the, there's no way to get between Leeds and Bradford without going straight through the middle. But if we're able to use the policies to think about, well, could that be something before anyone's building a tram? Could we build up that demand, that desire, etc.? Then that's what I'm really keen to see. And then replacing that with a different vehicle at a later stage is absolutely fine, but that's leading to it. But that might be around that local plan update too, then I think, where the houses are and where development is can be led to where we could provide a 10-minute bus if there were enough people there to service one. Just to comment, really, I'll take Chair, allow you to get on.
Okay, then I'll bring Councillor Trussell in then, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I mean, Martin, in his customary way, scattered a lot of pearls before us, which are very, very impressive. But I must admit, the paragraph in his report, which burnt itself on my brain, is paragraph 11, where it says changes to government guidance are a key risk to the LPU, and the government has begun a review of the planning system via the levelling up bill. The National Planning Policy Framework is also due to be revised with National Development Management Policies, which could constrain an LPA's ability to set local policy. And I think it's very important that we don't delude ourselves, and more importantly, we don't delude the people of Leeds, that we are the masters and mistresses of our own destiny when it comes to planning issues and all the challenges such as those associated with climate change. I suppose my question to Martin is how far our aspirations and those of the government, as expressed in some of the documents that are described on this agenda item and elsewhere, can be delivered unless there are major changes that allow us to mandate and to condition some of these key changes, because we can encourage and exhort and advise and advocate and say pretty please until we're blue in the face. But at the end of the day, quite often developers will just wave viability in our face, and everything that we're talking about, hopefully with good developers who see the commercial benefits rather than just the climate change benefits of what we're suggesting. Unless we've got that ability to mandate it, you know, God, the phrase that just sprang to mind is not one that I should use in public, but we're up a gum tree where it's a kind of phrase that David would use. And I suppose where are the sticking points that we anticipate might still not be resolved in these reviews of the Levelling Up Bill and MPPF?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Trustwell. So just in terms of I mean, you're right. There are two big risks to this. One is viability, because national planning policy framework says that in order for these policies to get through examination, they have to be sound. And one of the tests of soundness is around deliverability. Can you actually deliver it? Can enough developers deliver these policies on the ground to meet the requirements we've got for our housing growth and our employment growth? So we've been doing quite a lot of work with the development industry. We had a workshop in this room a few weeks ago. And I'm cautiously optimistic that we're seeing a lot more of an open door to these policies now at this stage than there's ever been. And I think that's down to a number of things. I think that's down to the kind of the sustainable development goals that companies and organizations have and where they get their funding from. I think that's about good practice in the city that we're able to latch on to and say, well, they've done it, and actually they did it without grant. They did it without funding. They just did it because that was their business model and they thought differently about it. So I'm confident in that respect. I think we're hearing a lot of goodwill from developers about this agenda, because I think they're finally realizing that actually their customers out there are the ones who are going to be living in these properties, and with the cost of energy being what it is, want them to be as efficient as they possibly can be. We obviously are working on a viability assessment, which will set out the way in which we think all these policies can be achieved at the same time. Obviously, given the markets in Leeds are so different, you're going to find it easier to deliver a lot of these policies in terms of the outer areas on, say, greenfield sites than you maybe are on a small site, constrained site in the inner city. So we need to work through that with the policies and not aim for the lowest common denominator, which everyone can meet, but think about how we we meet different developers. The second thing about the act, the national policy, I think more than ever within this local plan, I think we've realised that we are having to go beyond what the national planning policy framework explicitly says. But our route through that is the Climate Change Act, because legislation does trump guidance. And as long as we're not contravening the Planning Act, then we can, if we've got the right evidence in place to say we're going beyond the National Planning Policy Framework because it meets the requirements of the Climate Change Act, rather than because it meets the requirements that are set out in the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act. So it's thinking a bit differently about how we pitch this to an inspector. Several local authorities have done something similar. London, you'll not be surprised, is out in the lead, but London's a bit of an outlier because of its market value. Other local authorities have done this in bits. So Lancaster has done very well in terms of the zero carbon building agenda, as has Bristol. Manchester's got quite a good track record in terms of green infrastructure and green space. Very few have actually pulled it all together in one sort of narrative. And I think that's the policy's strength, because they do directly speak to each other in order to de-risk them. So I think you're right to raise the points, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we should be able to get through.
Did you want to come back?
No, Chair. I hope that Martin's optimism proves to be valid. I suspect that a lot of this will finish up appearing before the gentlemen and ladies in wigs and red gowns, though. No, we get a much better deal probably out of the loan now. I was thinking more of the court.
Thank you. Right, on that note, Councillor Buckley, it's over to you.
I'll be brief, Chair. It was just a comment and then a question, please. Martin will be familiar with the Clonmore Farm proposals. This is Leeds University, who own land around Clonmore Farm, which is in the far northwest of Old Woodley, just before it joins onto Adel. And we're extremely positive about it. We're very supportive. Given the choice between 600 houses or a big woodland, properly managed, you know, we are really very supportive. But just to say, just in comment about this, and it's amazing what these things bring up, because what seems to be a well-managed woodland proposal, no problem at all, thank you very much, go ahead, has immediately brought up a couple of issues. The university didn't intend or don't intend to have this as a kind of a mass public attraction, but just to attract people who are particularly interested in how the flora and fauna develop and that kind of thing. But nevertheless, you're likely to have people arriving in cars because there's no other way to get there. And they had no plans to put a car park in. And in a way, you think, well, we don't really want a car park, but then we don't want the cars on the country lanes, clogging the lanes up. Second issue is the fact that there is a kind of a long-established antisocial behaviour Friday night scene in the corner of the wood involving men only, which people think this will make it worse. So it's amazing how these things bring up other problems. But the question I wanted to ask, Chair, just very briefly, is I'm not on planning, but could Martin just confirm this? And we've had this question before, really. I could take him to 20 large houses in Old Woodley where the front gardens have completely disappeared. And you're not talking about parking for 2 or 3 cars. You're talking about areas of tarmac where you could get 30 cars on them. Now, is that supposed to be allowed, or is it a question of enforcement?
Do you want to come back, Martin?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Buckley. So the paving over of front gardens is allowable under what's called permitted development. So if you're a homeowner, you are allowed to make changes within your property. One of those changes is paving over your front garden, should you wish. There is the council's influence on that comes down to the type of paving and the type of hard surface that can be provided, that should be developed rather, and that it's permeable, and that if it isn't permeable, then it requires planning permission. Now that's set out in a paving over your front gardens guidance note, which has been recently done within my service and put on our website, and I can certainly give Helen the link to that. So we are constrained in terms of what we can do. We can insist on porous materials, and we can encourage, as we are doing through this guide, to say, well, you don't have to lose all of the natural aspect of your front garden simply to park a car in it. There's plenty of good practice ways in which you can park over certain plants, and you can actually put porous paving in and around plants to be able to park a car. But unfortunately, it is a problem. The government at the moment are restricting the ability of local authorities to put in place what are known as Article 4 directions, which remove permitted development rights from some areas. And actually what Leeds would need would be a blanket Article 4 direction, which covered the whole of Leeds, to say you can't pave over your front garden. But given the government's recent changes to the National Planning Policy Framework on this subject, it's looking unlikely that that would be feasible, because the government want Article 4 directions to apply to very small geographies. So it is a problem, but it's one that we've acknowledged within the local plan update, and we'll try and remove. What we can do when new development's built is we can remove the permitted development rights at the construction stage, so that all of this good infrastructure that we're putting in doesn't get taken out by a homeowner further down the line, so that we can ensure that, you know, all that green infrastructure, blue infrastructure remains.
Did you want to come back on that? Garthwaite, yep.
just briefly, I agree with an awful lot of what's been said, but going right back to the city centre, I mean, there are about, what, 25,000 more residents now in the city centre. They have their 20-minute neighbourhood there. And I think that that needs to be remembered. Of course, some of them are students who might not be there all year, but a lot of them do not have a car, and we are insisting that with developments that are in and near the city centre, that they don't have much scope for cars apart from disabled access and blue badge holders. So I think that that needs remembering, and particularly it gives a big opportunity for Kirkgate Market when I am on the Markets Management Board. And if later opening was ever to become possible there, I think it would be extremely popular. So that's it.
Thank you. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question on whether there's any way of including discussion on housing cooperatives as a way of developing and community generation. It may be beyond the scope at this point, but just wanted to raise the question. Thank you.
Martin.
So certainly, I think the policies that we'll put in the plan will be very much positive policies around local generation and micro generation. I don't think what we could do is sort of foresee every instance where that might arises, but actually if we've got some good examples of where we've got sort of community-led housing, for example, which has also delivered community-led micro generation, and that would be actually really quite good to put in as justification for that. But I don't think that would be something that we currently stop under current planning policy, but we could certainly be more encouraging of it.
Did you want to come back on that? Councillor Newton, welcome.
Yes, hello. I just wanted to pass comment really. It's just me thinking out loud, but I think it's a good conversation that we need to have in the city now. We have a big population. We've got lots of schools. There's been an increase in the city centre population, 10 million more people in the UK. And I've got 3 high schools in my ward. Now, parents are driving the kids to school, driving the children to school, and picking them up. And whilst leaving the car on idling is illegal under the Road Traffic Act, I believe, I read that a quarter of parents still admit to leaving their cars idling while they're picking the kids up from school. So, you know, there's lots of particles that are released as a result of that. And, you know, even Public Health England in 2019, I believe, asked for a complete ban on cars idling outside schools. And attached to those 3 high schools in my ward, we have 3 sixth form colleges as well. Now, more and more 17 and 18-year-olds are being able to afford their own car, which is great. But we need to make that 20-minute neighbourhood more attractive to them. And it's, you know, maybe we need to factor that in as well. It's just me thinking out loud, really. It's just something that we need to have a conversation about and something that we can't forget. And I understand that it's very niche and it's very specific, but local plan, it should be integrated into there. So anyway, it's just a comment. No real question. No real question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Anybody else got any questions or comments they'd like to make? Councillor Wadsworth.
On the point that's just been raised about engine idling, we were asked if we wanted to fund some engine idling banners for schools, and that some members did offer to do. Then it was taken out of our hands by someone who said it was going to be a corporate thing. I'm still waiting for mine. And I've visited all my schools now and said that I'd bring them around. And they said, when you bring them around, we'll put them on our back railings. But it's not happened. Perhaps you might be able to look into it, I think.
Yes, I can come in, Councillor. I've got an update. They've actually been delivered this week. So we waited we gave members plenty of notice to taking all of the requests in so we could print them all in one batch to get better value for money. But they've been delivered to, I think, more than 20 schools across the city this week. But my colleague's actually drafting an email to send to all councillors to thank them for their suggestions and to provide an update on that piece of work.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Okay, I thought that was quite a positive note to end on. I think we've had a wide ranging discussion. And Martin, we look forward to development of the plan and bringing it back in October. And then we'll be able to have a discussion. I think that's the only agenda item, is it, for that meeting so far? So I think we'll be able to spend a lot of time on that one.
Just a point before we finish. I did not get my papers notified to me, neither by email or actual papers. And I know Councillor Newton, I don't think did either. Well, I know how I found out how I got my papers were off my colleague who was on the committee last year, and I suspect the Lord Mayor got Councillor Newton's papers. But can we make sure that everybody who's on there is either getting a link emailed or supplied with papers?
Thank you, Councillor Blackburn. If I can apologise, because that's actually my fault. I don't understand why Councillor Newton didn't get his, but I do appreciate I did make a mistake with yours and I have corrected that now. Thank you.
Well, I'm all fully trained on ModGov, so I found it on there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. So I'll bring this, my first meeting, to a close. Thank you very much for your comments and contributions. And we will meet again on Thursday, the 21st of July at 2 p.m. Thank you very much.